Are Taplands bad in Commander? Short answer yes, long answer no. Let's dig into it. Taplands are lands that enter the battlefield tapped. These are lands that literally everyone is familiar with, as most Commander precons come absolutely bursting with them. Whether they be common taplands that gain you a life, uncommon taplands that make any color mana, or rare taplands that have decent upsides to them, are they any good in Commander? One of the cardinal sins I see when folks send me deck lists to review in my Discord is that there's this obsession with non-basic lands. This feeling that every land in your deck needs to make all of the colors of your mana all the time. But where's the line in this, and is it true or is it a fallacy? Let's explore. There are certainly scenarios where taplands are fantastic includes in a deck, so let's break them down first, starting with versatility. Some of the most used taplands in Commander are conditionally tapped lands like the Tango lands, named as such because you need 2 to tango. These lands may enter untapped, making them skirt a line between being untapped 2-color producing lands and a tapped 2-color producing land. Some of the other most used tap lands in Commander are the Triomes, coming in tapped but having major upsides of solving 3 of your colors at once, or being cycled if you need them to. But there's a huge hidden benefit to these tap lands in that they have basic land types. This means that they can be tutored for with fetch lands or with green ramp like Farseek, resulting in powerful color fixing options for a relatively reasonable price. Compare these with the check lands. They're significantly lower cost and have a much higher rate of coming in untapped, but are still used less often. This is because decks with more colors need some tap lands. This is one of the biggest reasons we may be so prone to including all of the non-basics in our decks, because we lack color fixing for 4 and 5 color decks at a reasonable price. It's this versatility, fixing colors, being searchable, and having a variable rate of entering tapped that makes these lands actually good sometimes. Now let's look at utility. When is it worth it to have a land enter tapped? And here we look at cards like Bojuka Bog, Path of Ancestry, or Minas Tirith. These are lands that include a spell effect on them, ranging from Graveyard Hate to draw fixing to raw card draw, that are worth coming into play tapped so you don't have to dedicate as many cards in your deck to the effect. This is excellent, and the same reason channel lands from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty are so widely used. It's a land when you need it, and a spell when you need it. But these tap lands are often both. Getting this effect on a land rather than a spell is worth the potential downside to including tap lands in your deck. Sometimes you really need the effect and a functioning land that creates the color at the same time. You'll find this on lands that make colors and do other things. The drawback is that they enter tapped. If you want a spell effect on a land that enters untapped, it's often going to cost the fact that that land will not create colored mana. Look at Kessig Wolfrun, Rogue's Passage, or Hall of Heliod's Generosity. Powerful effects, the lands enter untapped, but the more colors you run in your deck, the more of a liability it is to include a land that does not make your colors. But making your colors and having an effect stapled to it, it's worth entering tapped if it's a crucial effect to your deck, and not sacrificing your colored mana generation at the same time. Quick, drop a comment with your favorite utility land that enters tapped right now. The third criteria that makes a tapped land good is synergy. Does this land do something that helps your game plan? Let's look at Valgavoss Lair as an example. One of only 2 enchantment lands, this tap land produces only 1 color ever, though you can choose which, and will always enter tapped. Seems kinda bad, right? Except that, as an enchantment, it triggers Enchantress effects like Eidolon of Blossoms, Citizen Champion, or Entity Tracker to draw a card. A land that cantrips is very, very good. Same goes for synergies with Renma Creaking Nest. As a card with more than 1 type, enchantment and land, it triggers your commander's effect. That earns it a spot in the deck without a second thought. This is similar to the Bridge Cycle, 2-colored artifact lands that enter tapped. They enter tapped so you may not immediately care about them, but as artifacts, and indestructible to boot, they can trigger all sorts of effects and even help cards with affinity or metalcraft be better. In this case, synergy can be any potential negatives a tap land inherently has. Last example is a land like Field of the Dead. Entering tapped and not creating any colored mana may immediately mean that you don't look twice at it in normal circumstances, but there's a reason why it's one of the most expensive non-basic lands. It's powerful in the right deck. Any deck that is packed full of ramp or is packed full of non-basic lands loves Field of the Dead for free value it represents. A crossover between utility and synergy, it's a great example of how entering tapped can be ignored depending on a land's usefulness to your deck. Well, here I am having advocated for Taplands, and I'm sure some of you didn't need convincing, but let's look at why Taplands are less than ideal and why you may be hurting your deck by including the wrong Taplands. The major reason Taplands are bad is tempo. Playing a land that enters tapped means you can't use it for mana that turn, meaning you are on curve any longer. You can't cast a 3-mana spell if on turn 3 your third land has entered tapped. That means your opponents are all casting 3-mana spells while you're casting maximum a 2-mana spell this turn. Oof. One of the biggest examples I try to caution players against with this is Myriad Landscape. People love this land, Wizards loves this land, but it's a tempo disrupting nightmare that is killing you. Initially you may think, but it's a ramp spell on a land, it's in any color. But it's not. It's a black hole that sucks up your turns. First, it enters tapped. Let's say you play it on turn 3. Now you can't cast a 3-mana spell that turn while all your opponents are. Then on turn 4 you untap, play another land, and pop your Myriad Landscape for 2 more tapped lands. Now you only have the mana to cast a 1-mana spell on turn 4. You may be able to untap on turn 5 with 6 mana, but was it worth sacrificing turns 3 and turns 4 to do? Your opponents just got 2 turns ahead of you so you could ramp 1 turn ahead. That's not good. It's this loss of the ability to play on curve, this loss of tempo, that generally makes Taplands a bad idea. It's why you won't see Taplands in higher power level games, because well-made decks need every mana every turn and can't afford to play behind curve even for a single turn. This is why pre-con games may feel slower. It's because of the glut of Taplands in pre-constructed decks that you may have an entire turn cycle where everyone is playing a 3-mana spell on turn 4, and even later turns may feel like you're playing much lower cost cards than resources you could have had access to. But there's a caveat to this in that there's a tempo sweet spot where Taplands are in fact useful, a small window of opportunity where a land entering tap doesn't hurt at all. In fact, 2 windows. It's time to bring out the chalkboard! Ah, welcome back, old friend. Let's demonstrate, shall we? If we plot out turns on a graph versus usefulness of Taplands, we can see our points where Taplands are good. The first is very early game. Dropping a Tapland on turn 1 or maybe even turn 2 when you aren't casting anything else is harmless. We weren't going to use the mana that turn to cast anything anyway. But as you make it through the game, you want to be casting spells every turn, and the risk of playing a Tapland setting your tempo back gets higher and higher. But as we move through turns, we can see that the later in the game we get and the more resources we've generated, the less risk there is of playing a tapped land. That's because we have all of the mana or mana generation we need, and 1 land entering tapped doesn't hinder us from casting our spells. Which is where we add another metric. Let's overlay our mana curve onto this graph. We can see a correlation to the number of spells in our deck of a specific mana value, making it less ideal to play a tap land. If we only have 2 to 3 1-mana spells in our deck, playing a tap land turn 1 is fine. If we have 5 to 6 2-mana spells in our deck, it gets more difficult to play a tap land that turn for risk of not being able to cast those spells. And if the saturation of spells in our deck are at 3 mana, which for the average deck it is, it's nearly impossible to play a tap land on that turn and still be efficient. And that lack of efficiency continues until we reach this point on the graph, our 2 times average mana value. Once we can comfortably reach a point to cast 2 spells of our deck's average mana value at a time, it gets safer and safer to then play a tap land again. So let's say our deck's average mana value is 3. That means that on turns 3 through 6, we do not want to play a tap land under any circumstances. But on turn 1 and then turn 7 and beyond, we're fine playing tap lands. Now knowing that it's okay to have some tap lands in our deck, how do we determine how many we're safe to run? Let's keep looking at our mana curve. With the saturation of spells at each mana value, we can determine what percentage of our deck falls into the safe zone from a number of spells standpoint. MOXFIELD is amazing for this kind of data, by the way. So let's say 10% of our spells cost 1 mana or 7 plus mana. That means a handy rule of thumb is that 10% of our lands can be tap lands so as to not negatively affect our tempo. In a deck with a perfectly average 36 lands, that means about 3.5 lands can be tapped lands without negatively affecting tempo. That's it, 3.5. That's enough for just a few of those utility lands that I mentioned, and that's all decks really want. Anything more than that is actively damaging your gameplay. So let's wrap this up with some recommendations then. What do we replace Taplands with? Many of you are upgrading precons and wondering what to do with their often horrendous mana bases, or some of you might be watching this video and looking to make some changes to your decks. Here's my recommendations. Prioritize sometimes tapped lands. Check lands, tango lands, and slow lands. These are fine to play tapped early when it doesn't matter, but are assured to enter untapped when you need them at key points in your curve. Use the pain lands too. These lands are good and produce 2 colors when you need them and colorless mana when you don't. Sure, they may cost you a few points of life through the game, but as you play more and more lands, that matters less and less. You have 40 life. 1 damage only hurts when it's your last one. All of y'all are afraid of a little damage. And my last recommendation, play more basic lands. Basic lands always enter untapped, always produce a color you want, and are cheap. There's no reason why at least 50% of your lands aren't basics if you're in 1 to 3 colors. As you get up into 4 to 5 colors, that number goes down dramatically, but basic lands are your best friends in this game. Do not fear them. And that's my primer on tap lands. When are they good? When are they bad? And which ones should you be playing? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if this video helped you, be sure to slam that subscribe button. Also, be sure to check out my sponsor, MOXFIELD. MOXFIELD is the best deck building platform in the world and makes it easy to see all my brews all year long, all the time. With search versioning tools, it lets you find the right lands for your decks in any colors and lets you see edits to your decks too. Be sure to follow my profile while you're there. And if you're looking to pick up any cards, head over to my sponsor, Card Trader. Use my promo code right now for 5% off your first order of cards from any TCG. Their massive global marketplace makes it easy to find the cards you're looking for, in the treatments you're looking for, in the languages you're looking for, all hassle-free. Lastly, if you're looking to sell your cards, head to Card Conduit, the easiest way to sell your cards from Magic, Pokemon, or any other game. You can ship them unsorted to Card Conduit and they'll send you a check. Easy as that. It's the quickest way to sell extra copies or just old stuff you have sitting around. Try them out now. And if you want to see any other cool brews, check out my other videos on the channel. If you're a fan, you have to hit that subscribe button. Do it now. But as always, folks, good luck and have fun.